We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Those were the words of Adolf Hitler, spoken to his generals as they planned one of the largest land invasions to ever occur. As World War II continued to build into a deadlier and deadlier global conflict, the Germans were weighing the option of doing something that would stun the world. Open up warfare on a second front by choice. Even in spite of the consequences that such a decision had caused back in the Great War, Germany was careening toward a major conflict with their eastern neighbors in the Soviet Union. As the Führer grew paranoid about potential Soviet influence with Germany's Balkan interest, and the German military dangerously overestimated the weakened state of the Red Army, the two-front war would finally be on the horizon as the German armed forces and leadership alike prepared for Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union was stunning for many, including Joseph Stalin himself. This is because back in 1939, Germany and the USSR had actually signed a non-aggression pact which had made a clear border between the Soviet and German spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, and created a trade agreement the following year after the two nations had invaded and partitioned Poland amongst each other. It appears that despite World War II having already begun, and regardless of the vastly different ideologies in the Third Reich and USSR, Germany and the Soviet Union should have been solid allies for the foreseeable future. There were even negotiations and an offer made by Germany at one point for the USSR to join the Axis powers, and while this ultimately fell through, it wasn't due to any dramatic falling out or conflict. But Hitler believed that the only way to secure his own holdings and ambitions to the east was to take out his only competitor in the area, unbothered by any prior promises. With many Soviet officers having been killed in the Great Purge, the USSR being unsuspecting of a full-blown invasion by the Germans, and Germany's recent success to the west, the Führer decided that it would be now or never. At first, the Germans had hoped to launch Operation Barbarossa on May 15, 1941, but instead, the actual date that the first German hostiles launched their attack on the USSR was June 22nd, 38 days later. While the reason for this is debated, one common theory is that Finland and Romania, who both ended up with troops participating in the invasion, had not initially been included in the plan, and therefore needed time to prepare. Still, the most popular theory is that the necessitated German involvement in Italy's conflict over in Greece had forced the pause. Either way, when the invasion was finally ready to begin, Germany deployed a whopping 3.8 million personnel, making up one motorized training brigade, one independent regiment, and another 153 divisions. These troops were split into Army Group North, Army Group South, and Army Group Center, in addition to Army Norway, which would operate in the northern Scandinavian region along the Soviet border. Luftwaffe 1 would be the air support for Army Group North, Luftwaffe 2 for Army Group Center, and Luftwaffe 4 for Army Group South, while a total of 6,867 armored vehicles and roughly 65% of the Luftwaffe's aircraft were a part of these groups. The most heavily armed was Army Group Center, which was intended to tear through Poland and Belarus on their way to Smolensk and Moscow. Army Group North was aimed at the Baltics and Leningrad, where they would meet up with Finnish troops, and Army Group South would strike Ukraine and the Caucasus. For the Soviets, although some preemptive preparations had been made after multiple warnings from Soviet and Allied intelligence of an inevitable German attack, Stalin simply did not believe that he needed to take this threat entirely seriously. Nonetheless, nearly 5.5 million Soviet troops and 14,700 tanks had been mobilized and ready for battle. Even though Hitler himself said that if I'd known about the Russian tank strength in 1941, I would not have attacked, still, Stalin's reaction on the first day of the invasion proved deeply detrimental to his own men, indeed still with such a numerical and equipment advantage. The morning of the stunning and climactic launch of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet military districts near the Soviet border received NKO Directive No. 1, which warns them to avoid any provocative actions but nevertheless bring all forces to combat readiness. One German deserter had even hopes to warn the Soviets prior to this, but he was detained and interrogated even as the first shots were being fired. At 3:15, June 22, 1941, the war had begun, whether the Soviets were ready or not. The first acts of the invasion came in the form of the bombings of key cities in the Soviet portion of occupied Poland. Artillery attacks across the entire front line then commenced, and raids began throughout Russian and Ukrainian towns. Nearly 10 hours after the battle commenced and the unsure Soviets were doing their best to fight off the invasion, utterly unaware of its true scale and consequences, the Soviet foreign minister finally alerted the nation, announcing, "Without a declaration of war, German forces fell on our country, attacked our frontiers in many places. The Red Army and the whole nation will wage a victorious patriotic war for our beloved country, for honor, for liberty." But this was not an accurate reflection of the views of the USSR's leader when the invasion had begun. While the Germans declared to their own people that before 3 months have passed, we shall witness a collapse of Russia, Stalin was in denial, it seems, about the sheer breadth of the German attack and plans. As the Germans crushed the Soviet resistance within the early first hours of Operation Barbarossa, it wasn't until 7:15, 4 hours after the attack began, that Joseph Stalin issued NKO Directive No. 2, which acknowledged the invasion to some degree, but only ordered the Soviet troops to clash with the Axis forces where the latter had violated borders. It would take another 2 hours for Stalin to issue a third directive, which would finally authorize a full counteroffensive, although this still lacked a true grasp of the situation at hand, and Stalin had thought that it alone would be enough to end the German invasion. Obviously, and fatally, this would prove not to be true. On the first day alone, it is estimated that around 2,000 to 3,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed compared to less than 100 aircraft losses for the Germans. Human casualties were high for the Soviets as well, and the Germans were tearing through enemy lines with relative ease. Days later, the magnitude of the invasion finally sunk into the mind of Joseph Stalin, but by now, significant damage had been done. The operation would continue until December, when the tide ultimately came crashing back down on the Axis, ending the invasion in a devastating defeat for Germany. But the initial German success made a tragic impact. The total number of casualties for the Soviets was nearly 5 million, almost 4 million more than the German side. Although the start of Operation Barbarossa fails to correctly foreshadow the end result, it nevertheless would be an important period not only in the war, but also in the evolution of how the Soviet leadership came to address the entire conflict from that point on. The early blunders and disbelief in Joseph Stalin's response were a deadly lesson learned for the USSR, and day one of the German invasion would be a haunting reminder for months to come. Had the Soviets been better prepared, or even had the first 1, 2, or 3 directives been more appropriate responses to the actual severity of the situation, the first day of Operation Barbarossa could have also been the last. Or at least, it could have shortened the multi-month campaign and set a different trajectory entirely. This day set the tone for the whole operation. While often overshadowed by the rest of the invasion and subsequent warfare, it was this day that would make or break the entire thing. It was those early morning hours and first bombings and shots fired that started the clock, but it was the blundered Soviet response that set the timer for another 6 months of bloodshed and destruction.